In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's House Divided. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Seeing this in the swatch, I immediately thought Ben Franklin's suit. I went and I looked at a picture, and it's not really an exact match. It was close enough to spark that image in my mind, though. Also, don't skip the chromatography. It's freaky weird, really interesting to look at. This is a very pale and dusty purple in the writing. There can be some tone variation, and the same can be said for the shading. There can be, but you have to look for it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao 159 with a 1.1 stub. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we see that very light, dusty purple. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It's just simply there. Now, I'm going to tell you what's going on is that this is a bit more of an aggressive ink, and that's where the shading is going. It's really getting in and bonding with that paper fairly quickly. Looking at the medium nib, it is only a tad bit darker than the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It's doing that same thing where it's bonding with the paper very quickly. And that very fast bond is what's making the shading not be able to even show up. Now, can you really get in there and find a few spots that are a little bit lighter? You can. I just don't feel like it's worth that effort. Looking at the double broad, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the medium, and a whole lot darker than it was from the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's still giving a dusty purple, just much darker. I think it looks much nicer here as a tone. It's not shading, and I said it, but don't really expect shading from this ink. Looking at the back of the page, nothing came through and touched the page underneath, but you can see by how deep the ink gets in there, this is quite an aggressive ink, and I'm not really sure you can use the back of the page. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We still get no feathering. We still get no spread, which, to be honest, for an ink that bonds with the paper very quickly, that's kind of a surprise to not get some of that shading or some of that feathering. It could be a good ink for a lefty with that case, despite the fact that it's quite aggressive. We also don't really get any shading, but as it was before, you can go spot one or two darker letters. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It is right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, but it is giving a good solid performance, meaning, again, this could be a good ink for a lefty that maybe would be dragging their hand across some of the writing. It'll dry in time. Looking at the double broad, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the medium, just about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, and I really thought this one would feather, and it is not. It is not spreading. Very nice. It is not shading. It is giving a great purple tone, and if it wasn't for the fact that this is a double broad in a reporter notebook, I would call it a great match. I think it does look very nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we had no issue with bleeding or ghosting. You can easily write on the back of this paper. It outperformed Clairfontaine with this ink. Great match. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone, just a tad bit lighter, I think, than we had on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any kind of spread. We're getting, I'm going to say there actually is a little shading here. It's much easier to spot. If you look at the second line to third line, the word year on the third line, much darker than the words above it. And when it gets down to the fifth line, about is much lighter than Carl directly above it. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, but it is giving a very solid performance through this, which really makes me hope that it's not going to bleed through it all, because I think we're having a great left-handed ink with a number of different papers. Looking at the double broad, quite a bit darker than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any kind of spread. We're not getting any kind of shading. We're just getting a very nice, I'm going to say, mid-dusty purple tone, which, if this is what you go for, this could be a very good match. Looking at the back of the page, the dot that's circled is the one spot that did touch the page underneath from the double broad. Otherwise, yes, this ink did get deep into the page. Yes, there is a little bit of ghosting, but I do think if you wanted, you could use the back of the page. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get no shading. Just a light, dusty purple tone. I think it looks fairly decent here, although to my eye, it's got a little bit of a kind of grayish lean that just feels a little off, to be completely honest. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker and not showing that kind of little grayish lean that looked off, but definitely showing itself to be kind of a purpley magenta kind of tone. It's not feathering, not spreading, not shading, just simply there, being a good ink for that lefty. Looking at the double broad, we get about the same tone that we had with the medium, just much thicker lines. But that's just kind of even funny to point out. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It is doing a very good job, and this paper has done very well with fountain pen inks in the past, so I'm hoping that we don't have any kind of a bleed issue. Looking at the page underneath, you see that the double broad and the medium did bleed in a couple of spots, nothing tremendous. And when we see the back of the page, we can understand why, with the extreme amount of ghosting that occurred in all 3 nibs, I don't think you could write back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Bourgogne. Here is Diatramentis Purple Violet. Here is Diamine Amazing Amethyst. Here is Noodler's Purple Wampum. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. It is feathering just a tiny bit, and it is spreading a little bit, especially if you slow down even the slightest while you're writing. I don't know if you can hear the storm that's going on outside. It has the feather, it has the spread, it is not shading. This ink, or this paper, is not particularly known by me for doing well with fountain pen ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It is about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It is giving some feathering, but the feathering is really under control. It also is spreading some, but again, I think that spread is fairly under control in here, and that if you wanted to use it, you could. It is not shading, but this ink has not shaded really to this point. Looking at the double broad, the tone is a little bit darker than we had with the medium. just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have the tiniest bits of feather going on, really very under control, very manageable, very impressed. It does spread a little bit, which isn't any kind of a surprise, and as it hasn't really, it isn't shading here either. I didn't bother with circling all of the dots, and I really do hope that they show up because this paper is completely speckled with the ink as it bled through, and you can't use the page underneath. Looking at the back of the page, there's no question why, because of the extreme ghosting. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Noodler's, their Warden Bad Green Gator. Here is a gray ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, their Stone Gray. Here is a pink ink by Monteverde, their Rose Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Ackerman, their Dutch Masters number 13. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get a little darker tone, just a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. It does feather some, which we expect on this paper. It does spread some, which we expect on this paper. It does not shade some, which is good news for this paper because maybe it won't bleed through. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone as the fine, which is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit, under control, very under control, really. It does spread a little bit, again, under control, and in fact, very under control. It does not shade, but we haven't seen it really going on to this point. Looking at the double broad, we get a little darker tone than we had with the medium, little lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does have the tiniest bits of feather, which is incredibly impressive considering how wet the pen is and this paper. It does spread a little bit, again, just a little bit, which makes it impressive for this paper. And it does not shade. Looking at the page underneath, you see that, yes, it bled through all over the place, meaning you are going to write on that next page. And here's why with the extreme amount of ghosting. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? With this unfortunately aggressive ink, and that I'm saying thinking about the Clairfontaine, there is a need to work to avoid that. And so I really do suggest a dry or very dry, fine, extra fine, or medium nib to really get control of it. Though I did think the tone from much wetter, broader nibs looked better on the page. In either case, it is really good, I think, for lefties. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.